Let me just now go and take you to some slides, which are primarily from the Energy Transitions Commission. Just checking those are coming through okay. So this is from an organization called the Energy Transitions Commission. I'm a commissioner on that organization, as well as my role at IP Group. And I'm going to just try and share some sort of global perspectives from the work that we've done. So the Energy Transitions Commission, I'll use the acronym EC, is a coalition of organizations who are passionate about the transition to net zero. So that's people from the energy industry, from energy intensive industry, from civil society, from finance, and knowledge partners like Bloomberg and Systemic. And there's a shared sort of motivation across the members of this group to provide objective analysis around how we get to net zero, how we get to a sustainable economy that's not perceived to have been captured by any particular industry lobby. So there are lots of members on there. You'll recognize most of the organizations, but the perception that we want to try and create for the Commission is of neutrality, of objectivity, and of conclusions sort of derived from analysis and facts. The other thing to say about the Commission is the people involved are typically quite high level. So we have companies like Shell involved. The person from Shell who's the commissioner is the chairman of Shell. We have Saint-Gobain, it's the CEO of Saint-Gobain. So Rio Tinto is the chairman of Rio Tinto. So when we get together as commissioners, you've got some quite influential people around the table. And when we publish reports, the report is signed off by each commissioner as an individual. And we hope that because everyone as an individual is doing that, they have additional impact. So today, I think this is a very rich agenda, and what I want to try across the whole program, what I want to try and contribute to it is perspectives from our work, bringing in some analysis that's quite global, and then coming down to a couple of examples around China and the EU. So thoughts around decarbonization pathways for heavy industry. We've touched a lot on this already today, and that makes my job a bit easier, because I think the whole forum is very much in this direction. I'm going to talk a lot about industry here, but really what I mean is heavy industry, particularly basic materials. So this chart shows data for it's the IEA 2-degree scenario. And it's the residual greenhouse gas emissions in 2040 on that 2-degree scenario. And what you find is these hard-to-abate sectors that we've heard referred to a few times can potentially be the majority of residual greenhouse gas emissions by 2040, and therefore are something we start focusing on now. And within those hard-to-abate sectors, kind of heavy industry, iron and steel, cement, plastics, chemicals, are a large chunk of that. And that's where I'm going to focus my sort of comments today, because that's where sort of a lot of the high temperature processing comes in. I think we're going to talk a lot about the supply side, so producing these materials in low carbon ways, but actually there are a couple of other levers that are important. I want to briefly touch upon them. So you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions around heavy industry basic materials by reducing demand and also by energy efficiency, as well as by deploying low carbon technologies. The demand area is something we think is really important. It's not something where it's so much a question of new technologies, but it's around thinking about how economies work, how regulation fits into it, and changing consumer behavior. And this framework, which is again published in ETC reports, just helps think through how you break out that kind of demand reduction piece. And really what we're trying to do is for emissions associated with some of these products, you've got a useful service, uses materials, and you can think about breaking that down into emissions per unit materials, how much material used per unit product, and then the product for useful service. And these are all useful levers that we talk about with policymakers as well. And so on materials recirculation, I think we're going to need a lot more recycling of these basic materials, increase collection rates, reducing contamination by things like copper. For material efficiency, reducing waste of these high carbon materials in production and processes like that. And finally, circular business models is really about getting better asset utilization once you produce something. So that's a kind of conceptual framework. And I should mention, you'll see these slides I'm going to present today are quite wordy. I'm not necessarily going to go through everything on the slides. All these slides are going to be available afterwards. So if people want to see the detail, they're going to be available. So you don't need to make detailed notes. Then translating this framework into numbers, this is actually a really interesting output from some of the ETC work. So there's a lot of focus on things like hydrogen and CCS for reducing carbon intensity, but the demand side can also be quite significant. And if you look at a sort of, current practice scenario of nearly sort of 10 gigatons of CO2 per year from these basic materials in 2050, we can reduce the scale of that challenge by 40% by these demand reduction levers. And of the three I mentioned, the product to service efficiency, that's basically shared assets, using assets more efficiently, it's the single largest lever. And I just wanted to mention that because I think a lot of the conversation at the forum is going to be around the supply side. The demand side is also really important, and it's a really big part of our conversation with policymakers. So that's that first lever, that's demand reduction. The second lever is energy efficiency. I won't spend a lot of time here. I think to a lot of participants in the forum, it'll be clear that these processes are already quite efficient. Just trying to reduce efficiency of current processes has limited potential. That takes us on to that third lever, which is the supply side decarbonisation. And this is all the things that we've started talking about already. It's carbon capture and storage, its use of hydrogen for direct reduction, its use of biomass. And these, the analysis that we've done and we're seeing replicated elsewhere around the world shows that, we will not get to net zero without large deployment of these technologies. So these are going to be key industries by mid-century and essential to net zero. From my point of view as an investor in innovation, when you look at the current deployment rates and costs of those solutions, it's quite clear that we're going to need innovation. Some of the innovation is incremental, and some of it might require breakthrough areas. So we've highlighted some areas where we think we might need more breakthrough innovation, which is kind of a cue for policymakers to think about stimulating R&D. So that's things like higher temperature heat from electrical power, materials, particularly less carbon intensive cements. There's things like synthetic fuels as well. There's also a need to improve the cost competitiveness of electrolytic hydrogen, which I'm sure you'll hear much about during the forum, and improving the cost efficiency of carbon capture. So from being an area that venture capitalists like me really didn't think was very interesting, maybe even 5 years ago, this whole kind of requirement for massive innovation has really created a lot of interest in these industrial areas in the last couple of years. One of the challenges, though, with this whole space is when you start talking to policymakers around green materials, green steel, aluminium, plastics, the material impacts in terms of cost of goods for a consumer might not be very large. But for producers, the cost impact of moving to a zero carbon version of their commodity can be very large. This shows some data from the ETC on the differences between these three sectors: steel, cement, and ethylene. And we found ways of making zero carbon ethylene look very expensive for the producer of that commodity. So there's a variety of different costs. And what we're finding is that they're all positive, and that then feeds into the next section, which is around kind of the financing of all of this. So this next section is around about the investment required, and I'm going to put that into a broader context around how we get to net zero in general. So, industry is very important, but also, as has already been referred to, the whole net zero transition is about the availability of very low cost renewables. So we want to see renewables becoming the major source of energy by mid-century, and huge investments required in wind and solar in particular. And just some numbers for that today, global power production from all sources is around about 25,000 terawatt hours. That needs to rise to close to 100,000 terawatt hours by the middle of the century. And that must be almost all renewables. And that's going to be a huge amount of investment. There's also a huge investment required in built infrastructure, so buildings, commercial, domestic buildings, as well as transport and industry. We have made some estimates around what that actually means over this next 30 years. And the average annual investment is just under $1 trillion a year, US dollars a year. Now that is a huge amount of capital, but it's still less than 1% of global GDP. And about 2.4% of global savings. So the point we try to make in the ETC is these are large amounts of capital, but they're not unaffordable. Within that overall amount of investment, if you look at where investment flows, on the left of this chart here, this shows sort of investments on the business as usual, and then increments as you go across the chart to a deep decarbonization scenario. One of the things that's quite startling is when you compare investments in things like power to investments in buildings, they're actually quite small. So we on an annual basis across the globe invest huge amounts of capital in buildings. It's a very valuable source of wealth. And that is a much larger amount of investment than what we're talking about for power and industry. And then in particular, coming to the incremental investment in heavy industry highlighted in blue, this is the European example. The actual amounts, it's a large amount of money, up to $5 billion a year of euros a year of incremental investment. But compared to other investment going on, it's actually relatively small. So we think that the overall investment is affordable, but particularly the investment in heavy industry is relatively small compared to what we're talking about for power, for example. So what is that investment in heavy industry? And it will come as no surprise to attendees to this conference that we're talking about things like CCS and hydrogen. So there's both an infrastructure requirement around transportation and storage, and non-infrastructure investment in plants. So that's things like green hydrogen production. And then we think quite a substantial investment in R&D. One of my messages, again, I repeat this quite a lot, is it's fashionable to invest in things like solar cells, batteries, these types of things. There's a lot of that happening in private companies. A good area for public sector R&D, but for government investment, things like mission innovation, is these sort of basic materials, heavy industry investment. Again, using Europe as a case study, what does that look like? So the baseline investment in Europe per annum is about 5 billion euros. That's setting aside any zero carbon agenda. So we're talking about an incremental approximately 5 billion euros to get towards this net zero target. Really, what we're saying here is that we need to create incentives for the private sector to make that investment. And that's got to be followed up with financing models. So we think this amount of investment is absolutely affordable, but there are structural challenges that make it difficult.
5 minutes to go, Robert.
Sorry?
5 minutes to go.
5 minutes. Okay, thanks. So we think there is a big financing challenge here in industry, and the big solution, well, there are two solutions to that. So one is carbon prices. We've heard reference to that. The EU carbon price is now above 20 euros a ton, and that's been very, very helpful. And the other thing that's again been referred to is around standards and certification. So industry does need policy intervention, and we've been making that point very clearly. But there's also an opportunity for standards and certification. If you make those interventions, you have the potential to create a virtuous circle of investment, production, and demand. So we want to create initial demand for these greener versions of these materials. That triggers investment. You get more production. The availability of products triggers more demand. So we can have this virtuous circle, but it's all got to be triggered by having the right policies in place to create the demand in the first place. Okay, the last few minutes, I'm just going to talk briefly about some numbers. These are again available to download from the ETC website. I'll start with China. So we've done a large piece of work with China, actually working quite closely with Chinese governments and stakeholders in the country around how that economy can get to net zero in 2050. Industrial activities are hugely important. And so, this is an instance of how China can be net zero. China is a huge producer of steel today. In the scenario we've produced in the report, we see that production approximately half and move primarily to secondary steel, but also use these decarbonized production routes involving, for example, hydrogen. And we also see a huge reduction in demand for cement. Chinese production of cement has been a huge contributor to greenhouse gases in the last sort of 10 years, and that needs to come down significantly. And that's the energy efficiency. It's about using zero carbon energy for heat and a fair amount of CCS. So to get China to net zero, again, this is something you can see in the detailed reports. It's a significant transition on energy systems, but we think that's affordable. And then by 2050, you have an economy which is using about 15,000 terawatt hours of zero carbon electricity, about 81 megatons of zero carbon hydrogen, which is set against maybe 600 global demand. And if you can get the hydrogen and zero carbon power balance, there is still a residual CCS requirement, but it's about 1 gigaton. So this is a sort of detailed scenario that you can see in the report. The point being that we've gone and had a lot of time with stakeholders in China to show how that economy can get there and how important these industrial processes are. Final point on China is this is not just about them reducing carbon emissions, it's an economic opportunity. There's significant employment creation opportunities as well as improved air quality. And finally, I'll just quickly canter through some of the work that we're doing with Mission Possible and the EU Green Deal. So the ETC has set up a platform with the World Economic Forum around Mission Possible, our report on hard to abate sectors. And really what I'm trying to show here is there are now quite a lot of activities around each of these harder to abate areas. I'll take steel as a particular example. Steel, as I think most people attending this conference will be aware, technically absolutely can be produced without carbon emissions. But there are a number of challenges to make that happen. There's challenges across the supply chain. There's challenges across carbon pricing, and there's challenges across international trade. So it's possible technically, but we need to get the economics and policy to work together. And that's what this Net Zero Steel Initiative is doing. We're working with the EU Green Deal, for example, on policies. We're trying to stimulate markets and demand and bring in the finance sector. and look at things like enabling methodologies like labeling. And so finally, we're active at the ETC right across the EU Green Deal. And the point being, 2 years ago, as a group, we had no real interaction with the EU. And by doing all this work, that's really got us involved in these crucial bits of policy work like the EU Green Deal. So people are listening to this work. We're getting people really listening to these messages in China and in Europe as well. So it's starting to really be taken seriously. So finally, conclusions. I think it probably comes no surprise to attendees here that it's important to do these heavy industry investments. The investment requirement when you do a top-down analysis is relatively low. It looks expensive if you're an operator of a steel mill or cement kiln, but the total amount for the economy is much smaller than what we're going to need to do for renewables. And that's a really important message to get across to people. The challenges are around how do you capture value? If you're that producer, if you're ArcelorMittal, for example, a member of the commission, how do I capture value from making that investment? How do I get over my dependence on national infrastructure for things like CCS? You've got to trust government to organize itself. And I guess these are my personal adjectives. There's a need for intelligent and stable government policies in the dialogue with industry. To get that right, this can happen, I think, relatively easily. And the final point is to reiterate around standards and certification, greenness. People like Apple talking about green aluminium, green steel starting to become a term. So certification and standards are also going to be very powerful. Okay, that I think was everything I had. So thank you very much for your attention.